My wife shopped online constantly and made me pay for it because it is her therapy. I returned everything, including her. So, my wife Tessa and I had been married for 8 years, and she'd always liked shopping. But when the pandemic hit and she discovered online shopping, it became an addiction. Packages arrived daily, sometimes 15 in one day. She'd have them delivered to her sister's house, our house, her mom's house, anywhere to hide the volume. I was working 2 jobs to pay for everything while she stayed home, claiming she was building an influencer career that never materialized. She had 11 followers and 5 were family members. Every credit card was maxed. She'd opened cards in my name without telling me. When bills came, she'd say shopping was her therapy, and I should be supportive of her mental health. She actually said buying things online released dopamine, and it was basically medical treatment. She'd spend 6 hours a day scrolling shopping apps, had accounts on 40 different sites, knew every sale, every coupon code, every cashback deal. But she never looked for the best price, just bought whatever she saw first. She bought things we didn't need. 7 vacuum cleaners because each had different features. 19 throw pillows for our 2-person couch. Exercise equipment she never used but kept buying more because the new one would motivate her. She had boxes in the garage still unopened from 2 years ago. When I tried to return things, Tessa would cry and say I was controlling and abusive for denying her happiness. She told her friends I was financially abusing her by questioning purchases. Her mom called me saying real men provide for their wives' needs. Her needs apparently included 43 pairs of identical black leggings because each site described them differently. She'd buy the same item from multiple stores forgetting she'd already ordered it. We had 6 identical coffee makers still in boxes. She claimed they were investments for when ours broke. Ours was only a year old. The worst part was she'd use my credit card saved in her phone. She had all my information memorized. If I got new cards, she'd take photos while I slept. I tried using only cash, but she'd apply for new cards using my social security number she'd memorized from our tax forms. When packages arrived, she'd hide them and slowly introduce items like they'd always been there. I'd find new lamps and she'd swear we'd had them for years. She gaslighted me about throw blankets, saying I was losing my memory if I didn't remember buying 12 of them. She actually made me think I was going crazy until I started counting everything in the house. Our bedroom had 37 decorative pillows. Nobody needs 37 pillows. She bought seasonal decorations for holidays we didn't celebrate. We're not religious, but she bought Easter decorations for $8,000 because they were limited edition. She said they'd be worth more someday. They're still in the basement, worth nothing. She spent $4,000 on Christmas ornaments for a tree we didn't have because she planned to buy one eventually. That was 3 years ago. No tree yet, but ornaments keep coming. When I tried to cancel the internet to stop her shopping, she used her phone data and ran up a $2,000 phone bill. When I canceled the credit cards, she used buy now, pay later apps. When I froze my credit, she used her mom's information with permission because her mom thought I was being mean. Then I found out Tessa was lying about prices. She'd tell me something cost $50 when it was $500. She'd edit email confirmations before showing them to me. She had a secret bank account where refunds went, but she never told me about returns. She was essentially stealing from us by keeping refund money. But here's what Tessa didn't know. Every single return had to go through me because I'd slowly changed all the passwords to her shopping accounts. She didn't notice because saved payment methods still worked. I could see every order, every tracking number, every delivery date. I started returning everything the moment it arrived. But I didn't tell her. I'd let packages pile up, then return them all while she was at her sister's. She'd come home asking where her packages went, and I'd say I never saw them. She'd check tracking, and it would say delivered. She'd call customer service going crazy about missing packages. They'd investigate and find nothing because I'd already returned everything. She started accusing delivery drivers of stealing, posted in neighborhood groups about package thieves, set up a camera to catch the thief. The camera caught me returning everything, but she never checked it because she was too busy shopping for more cameras. I returned those too. Then came Black Friday, Tessa's Super Bowl. She stayed up all night shopping, spent $30,000 in 6 hours, used credit cards I didn't know existed, bought furniture we had no room for, bought a hot tub for our apartment that doesn't allow hot tubs, bought exercise bikes when we already had 3 unused ones. She was so proud of her deals. I returned every single item. But this time I did something different. I used the refund money to pay for something else. A divorce lawyer. The best one in town. The returns totaled enough for a massive retainer plus moving costs. When Tessa realized everything was gone again, she had a meltdown. I sit in my car outside our apartment building watching Tessa through the living room window as she tears through rooms looking for her missing Black Friday purchases. She's pulling boxes from closets and dumping them on the floor, checking her phone every few seconds, then throwing it down and grabbing more boxes. My phone keeps buzzing with increasingly unhinged texts, demanding to know where everything went. The messages started calm, asking if I saw packages, then moved to accusing me of hiding them, and now she's threatening to call the police about theft. I don't respond because I'm meeting Charles Yates in 40 minutes with a $30,000 retainer from her own shopping addiction. I watch her for another 5 minutes as she calls what must be customer service, pacing back and forth with one hand waving in the air. Then I start the car and drive to the address Charles gave me, leaving my phone on silent in the cup holder where it continues lighting up with her calls. Charles's office is in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparer. Nothing fancy, but his reviews said he's ruthless in protecting his clients. The waiting room has cheap furniture and outdated magazines, but I don't care about appearances right now. The receptionist tells me to go straight back, and I find Charles at a desk covered in folders and legal books. He's maybe 50 with gray hair and reading glasses, wearing a suit that's seen better days. I show him everything: the credit card statements, the secret accounts, the cards she opened in my name, screenshots of her edited email confirmations where she changed $500 to $50. He spreads it all across his desk, studying each document carefully, making notes on a yellow legal pad. He looks at the documentation for 10 minutes without saying anything while I sit there trying not to fidget. Finally, he takes off his glasses and looks at me. He says this is the clearest case of financial abuse he's seen in years. The fraud is documented, the deception is obvious, and the scope is massive. He asks if I'm absolutely sure about divorce because once we file, there's no easy way back. I tell him I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Charles explains that in our state, debt incurred without a spouse's knowledge or consent isn't automatically shared, especially when there's fraud involved. He says we'll file for divorce citing financial infidelity and request that Tessa be held responsible for the debt she created. He warns me it's never clean, and I'll likely end up with some of it anyway because we're married, and some judges view all marital debt as shared. But with this much evidence of fraud and deception, we have a strong case for making her take the majority. He walks me through what happens next: the filing process, the waiting period, the likely responses from her lawyer if she gets one. He estimates this will take 4 to 6 months if she cooperates, longer if she fights. I sign the retainer agreement, and he says he'll have papers drawn up by tomorrow. He tells me to document everything from this point forward: every purchase she makes, every threat she issues, every manipulation attempt. I leave his office feeling lighter than I have in years, like I finally took control instead of just reacting to her chaos. When I finally go home that night, Tessa is surrounded by empty boxes she's pulled from the garage, frantically checking her phone and calling customer service numbers. Cardboard is everywhere, packing materials scattered across the floor, and she's got her laptop open with multiple shopping sites pulled up. She doesn't even look up when I walk in, just screams that someone must have hacked all her accounts because everything shows as returned. She's on the phone with what sounds like Amazon, demanding they investigate the unauthorized returns on her account. I set my keys down and tell her we need to talk. She finally focuses on me, mascara streaked down her face from crying, her hair a mess from running her hands through it. I see the moment she realizes something has fundamentally changed. Her eyes narrow, and she ends her call without saying goodbye. She asks where I've been and why I'm not helping her figure out who's stealing from us. I don't answer the question, just tell her to sit down because we need to have a serious conversation. I tell her I've been returning everything for months and used the Black Friday refunds to hire a divorce lawyer. The words come out calm and measured, no anger or emotion, just facts. Tessa's face goes through shock first, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. Then disbelief as she shakes her head saying, "I'm joking, this isn't funny." Then rage as she stands up and starts yelling that I had no right to return her purchases. And then straight to manipulation as she starts hyperventilating and saying I'm trying to kill her by taking away her coping mechanism. She grabs my arm begging me not to do this, promising she'll get help, swearing she'll stop shopping. The promises pour out fast and desperate. She'll go to therapy, she'll close all her accounts, she'll get a real job, anything I want. But I've heard these promises 100 times before, and I'm done believing them. I pull my arm away and tell her the papers will be served soon, and she should probably get her own lawyer. She collapses onto the couch crying, saying I'm abandoning her when she needs me most. Tessa switches tactics and pulls out her phone to call her mother, putting it on speaker so I can hear Regina screaming at me for being a controlling monster. Regina's voice fills the apartment, high-pitched and furious, calling me every name she can think of. She says real men support their wives through mental health struggles, not abandon them. Within minutes, Courtney is also calling, then Isaac, all of them yelling over each other about how I'm abandoning my wife when she needs support for her mental health. Isaac's trying to be the voice of reason, saying we should go to counseling. That divorce is extreme. Courtney's crying and begging me to reconsider. Regina just keeps screaming about what a terrible husband I am. I let them rant for 5 minutes, listening to their accusations and guilt trips, feeling nothing but relief that I'm getting away from all of this. Then I hang up mid-sentence while Regina is still talking. I tell Tessa I'm sleeping in the spare room tonight, and she needs to stay away from me. She follows me down the hall begging and crying, but I close the door and lock it, hearing her collapse against it on the other side. The next morning, I wake up to find Tessa has called in sick to her non-existent influencer work and is camped outside the spare room door with printed articles about shopping addiction being a real disorder. I hear papers sliding under the door one by one, each with sections highlighted in yellow about how partners need to be supportive and understanding. She's narrating as she slides them, reading key passages out loud about how shopping addiction affects the brain's reward system just like drugs. I ignore her and check my phone to find 37 missed calls from her family and a dozen voicemails I don't bother listening to. I text Charles asking how fast we can move on this, and he responds immediately saying papers will be ready by end of day. I take a shower in the spare bathroom and get dressed for work, while Tessa continues her presentation outside the door. When I finally open it to leave, she's sitting on the floor surrounded by printed research papers, looking up at me with desperate hope. I step over her and head for the front door without saying anything. I go to work, and my boss notices I look like hell, so I end up telling Gavin the whole story in the break room. Gavin's been with the company for 15 years, and we've always gotten along but never really talked about personal stuff. But today I just need to tell someone who isn't part of the chaos. I lay out everything while we drink terrible break room coffee, the shopping addiction, the fraud, the returns, the divorce. Gavin listens without interrupting, nodding occasionally, and when I finish, he tells me he's been divorced twice. He says the first month is the hardest, because they'll try everything to make you feel guilty and change your mind. They'll cry, manipulate, get family involved, make promises they won't keep, anything to avoid facing consequences. He tells me to stay strong and not let her tears make me doubt my decision. Then Gavin offers me his spare room if I need to get out fast. He says his daughter moved out last year, and the space is just sitting there collecting dust. I thank him and tell him I might take him up on that soon. Charles texts me mid-afternoon that the divorce papers are ready and asks if I want them served by a process server or if I'll deliver them myself. I choose the process server because I know if I hand them to Tessa directly, she'll spend hours trying to manipulate me into tearing them up. She'll cry and beg and make it impossible to just leave the papers and walk away. Charles says he'll arrange it, and someone will serve her tomorrow at the apartment while I'm at work. I feel relieved knowing I won't have to be there for that moment. Won't have to see her face when she realizes this is really happening. The rest of my workday drags as I imagine how tomorrow will go. Tessa answering the door expecting a package and getting divorce papers instead. That evening, Tessa tries a different approach, dressing up and making my favorite dinner like we're newlyweds again. She's wearing the dress she wore on our first anniversary, her hair and makeup done perfectly, candles lit on the dining table. She's cleaned the entire apartment and hidden all evidence of her shopping, even put some of the garage boxes out by the dumpster. The smell of pot roast fills the apartment, and she set the table with our good dishes we never use. I walk in, and she greets me with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes, asking how my day was like we haven't been fighting. I eat the dinner because I'm hungry, and I paid for the groceries anyway, but I don't engage with her attempts at conversation. She tries talking about memories from when we first got married, about trips we took, about inside jokes we used to have. I give one-word answers and keep eating. I see her frustration building when her usual tactics aren't working, her smile getting more forced, her voice getting tighter. She finally breaks and asks what she has to do to fix this. I tell her there's nothing to fix because I'm done, and I take my plate to the kitchen and go back to the spare room for the night. The next day at work, I'm sitting at my desk trying to focus on a spreadsheet when my phone starts buzzing. Tessa's name lights up the screen and I almost don't answer, but something makes me pick up. The second I do, she's screaming so loud I have to pull the phone away from my ear. She's yelling that a man just showed up at our door with divorce papers, that I'm a monster, that she can't believe I'm doing this to her. Her voice is shaking and high-pitched and I can hear her crying between the screaming. She threatens to max out every credit card we have left, to tell everyone I know that I'm abusive, to make sure I never see a penny of anything we own together. She says she'll ruin me, that I'll regret this, that her lawyer is going to destroy me in court. I wait for her to take a breath, and then I tell her calmly that Charles already knew she'd react this way and we've frozen everything we can. She starts screaming again, but I hang up while she's mid-sentence. My hands are shaking a little as I set the phone down, and I notice my coworker at the next desk is staring at me. I just shake my head and go back to my spreadsheet, but I can't focus on the numbers. My phone buzzes again 2 minutes later. Then again. Then again. I watch it light up 17 times in the next 2 hours, Tessa calling over and over. I finally block her number around lunchtime and get maybe 10 minutes of peace before my phone rings from a different number. I answer thinking it might be Charles, but it's Courtney. Her voice is softer than Tessa's, but just as desperate. She begs me to reconsider, saying Tessa is having a complete breakdown and hasn't stopped crying since the process server left. Courtney tells me Tessa already ordered $6,000 worth of stuff on a credit card I didn't even know existed, that she's spiraling, that she needs me. I tell Courtney that she helped make this worse by letting Tessa use her address for secret deliveries all these years. I say that maybe this breakdown is exactly what Tessa needs to finally face reality instead of everyone protecting her from consequences. Courtney's voice gets tight and she says, "I'm being cruel," but I tell her I'm being honest for the first time in years. She hangs up on me, and I block her number too. When I get home that evening, I walk in and immediately see Isaac and Regina sitting on my couch with Tessa between them. Tessa's eyes are red and swollen, and she won't look at me. Isaac stands up and gestures for me to sit in the armchair across from them, like this is his house instead of mine. He says they need to talk, that they're here because they're worried about both of us. Regina has her arm around Tessa, who's staring at the floor. Isaac does most of the talking, his voice calm and reasonable like he's mediating a business dispute. He says divorce is extreme, that what Tessa needs is support and therapy, not abandonment. He talks about marriage vows and working through problems and how everyone has struggles. Regina nods along and adds that I should be more understanding of Tessa's mental health. I sit there listening for about 10 minutes while Isaac explains all the reasons I should give Tessa another chance. Then I get up and walk to the spare room where I've been keeping a folder. I come back and sit down and open it. I start reading numbers out loud. The total debt, which is now over $120,000. The credit card she opened in my name without permission, with dates and account numbers. The purchases she lied about, showing them the real prices next to what she told me they cost. The secret bank account where she kept refund money, with transaction histories. I read every single number clearly and slowly. Regina tries to interrupt, saying this isn't appropriate, that I'm embarrassing Tessa. But I keep reading. I pull out bank statements and credit reports and lay them on the coffee table. I show them proof that Tessa destroyed our financial future, that this isn't just shopping, but fraud and theft and years of lies. Isaac's face changes as I go through each document. His mouth gets tight, and the reasonable expression disappears. He looks at the numbers, really looks at them, and I see him realize this isn't what he thought it was. Tessa starts crying harder, saying I'm humiliating her in front of her parents, that I'm being cruel. I tell them they need to see the truth of what they've been enabling all these years before they lecture me about being supportive. Regina's face is pale, and she keeps shaking her head like she can't believe what she's seeing. Isaac picks up one of the credit card statements, the one showing a card opened in my name last month. His hands are shaking slightly as he holds it. The intervention falls apart when Isaac asks Tessa directly if she really opened credit cards in my name without my permission. His voice is quiet and careful. Tessa looks at the floor and doesn't answer at first. Regina jumps in saying I should have been paying more attention to our finances, that this is partly my fault for not monitoring things better. But Isaac tells his wife to stop talking. He says they've made this worse by always taking Tessa's side, by giving her money without asking questions, by acting like her shopping was harmless. Regina starts to argue, but Isaac's voice gets firm in a way I've never heard before. He says they enabled this, and they need to accept that. Tessa is crying into her hands now, her shoulders shaking. Isaac looks at me and says he understands now why I'm doing this. Regina helps Tessa stand up and wraps her arms around her. They head toward the door, and Isaac hangs back for a second. He puts his hand on my shoulder and says he gets it now, but he hopes somehow we can work it out. I don't say anything, and he follows his wife and daughter out. That night, I pull 2 suitcases from the closet and start packing. I grab clothes, my laptop, important documents, the basics. Tessa sits on the bed watching me without saying anything. She stopped crying, but her face is blank and tired. I pack methodically, folding shirts and rolling socks, and she just stares. When I zip up the second suitcase and pull out my phone to text Gavin, Tessa finally moves. She gets up and stands in front of the bedroom door, blocking it. She says if I walk out, I'm proving I never really loved her. Her voice is flat and empty. I tell her I loved her enough to work 2 jobs for years funding her addiction. I say love doesn't mean letting someone destroy you. She doesn't move, so I gently take her shoulders and move her aside. She doesn't resist, just steps to the side like a puppet. I pick up both suitcases and walk out. Gavin's spare room is small with just a twin bed and a dresser, but it's clean and quiet. I set my suitcases down and sit on the bed and realize how tired I am. Gavin knocks and comes in with clean sheets and towels. He tells me to take all the time I need to figure things out, that his daughter won't be moving back anytime soon. I thank him, and he leaves me alone. That night I sleep for 10 hours straight without waking up once. No checking for packages, no listening for Tessa shopping on her phone at 3 in the morning, no anxiety about what new disaster I'll find tomorrow. Just sleep. When I wake up, it's almost 9 and I can smell coffee. Gavin made breakfast and set out a plate for me. We eat scrambled eggs and toast, and he doesn't ask me any questions, just talks about the weather and work and normal things. Charles calls mid-morning to say Tessa hired a lawyer. Some guy named Roberto Harmon, who apparently specializes in defending people accused of financial misconduct. Charles sounds almost pleased when he tells me this. He says it's good news because it means Tessa is taking this seriously, even if her lawyer's strategy will be painting me as controlling. Roberto will probably argue that her shopping is a medical condition, requiring treatment, not punishment. Charles says we need to meet to prepare for whatever response Roberto files. We schedule something for later in the week. I hang up and realize this is really happening, that we're past the point of Tessa crying her way out of consequences. Over the next week, Tessa's family tries everything to get me to come back. Courtney shows up at my work with a sealed envelope, a letter from Tessa that I don't open. I hand it back to her and she leaves it on my desk anyway. Regina calls my mother and complains about me for an hour, telling her I'm abandoning her daughter. My mom calls me confused, and I have to explain the whole situation. Isaac sends texts every other day, asking if we can meet for coffee to talk man to man. I ignore most of it, but something about Isaac's texts feels different from the others. He seemed genuinely shocked when he saw the evidence. I finally text back and agree to meet him. We meet at a coffee shop near his office on a Wednesday morning. Isaac looks older than he did at the intervention, tired around the eyes. He orders black coffee and we sit at a corner table away from other people. He doesn't waste time with small talk. He tells me straight out that he and Regina gave Tessa money multiple times over the years when she said we were struggling. Probably $30,000 total that she never mentioned to me. He thought it was going to bills and groceries. Now he realizes it just funded more shopping, and he feels guilty for enabling her without understanding what was really happening. His voice cracks a little when he says he should have asked more questions. I tell him I appreciate his honesty, but I can't stay married to someone who's been lying and stealing for years. He nods slowly and stares into his coffee cup. He says he understands even if Regina doesn't. We sit there for a few more minutes, not saying much. When we leave, he shakes my hand and tells me to take care of myself. I watch him walk to his car, and I feel bad for him because he's realizing his daughter isn't who he thought she was. Charles called 2 days later to say we had an appointment with Alina Ritter, a credit counselor who specialized in financial abuse cases. Her office was in a professional building downtown, the kind with marble floors and a directory board listing accountants and lawyers. Alina met us in a conference room with a long table covered in folders and a laptop. She was maybe 50 with reading glasses on a chain and a no-nonsense handshake. She pulled my credit reports before we even sat down and spread them across the table like evidence at a crime scene. She pointed to accounts I'd never seen before, 2 store cards from retailers I didn't shop at, both opened within the last month. Tessa had used my information after I thought I'd frozen everything. Alina traced her finger down columns of numbers, adding silently, and when she looked up, her expression told me it was worse than I thought. The total debt was over $120,000, not counting the mortgage and car loans. She said realistically I'd be dealing with this for years, even with the best outcome. Some of the debt would stick to me no matter what we did. Charles took notes while Alina explained the difference between joint debt and fraudulent debt, how creditors would fight me on every account Tessa opened without permission because I was her spouse. She said courts assumed married people shared financial responsibility unless I could prove I had no knowledge of the accounts. I sat there looking at the numbers and felt like I was drowning in paper. Alina pulled up fraud report forms on her laptop and started walking me through the process. She said I needed to file police reports for identity theft, dispute every fraudulent account with the credit bureaus, and send certified letters to each creditor explaining the situation. She warned me that because Tessa was my spouse, proving fraud was harder than if a stranger did it. Some creditors would fight the disputes, claiming I should have been monitoring our finances more carefully. They'd argue that married people have access to each other's information, and I was responsible for not catching it sooner. She showed me a timeline of how long each step would take, months of back and forth with credit agencies and collection departments. I'd have to gather documentation proving Tessa opened accounts without my knowledge, statements showing I never used the cards, evidence of her deception. Alina said some cases took years to resolve, and even then I might end up responsible for a portion of the debt. She asked if I had copies of the edited email confirmations Tessa showed me, the ones where she changed prices. I did, saved on my phone from when I started documenting everything. She said those would help prove a pattern of deception. Charles asked about the secret bank account where Tessa kept refund money, and Alina said that was strong evidence of intentional fraud, not just impulsive shopping. We spent 2 hours going through every account, every card, every loan, building a case file that felt like it weighed more than I did. When we finished, Alina printed out a packet of forms and instructions. She said to call her when I had questions because I would have questions. I left her office feeling overwhelmed by how much work it would take to untangle this mess, like Tessa had tied knots in my financial life that would take years to undo. 3 days later, Charles forwarded me a letter from Roberto Harmon, Tessa's lawyer. It was 6 pages long on official letterhead, full of psychological terminology and legal arguments. Roberto claimed Tessa suffered from compulsive buying disorder, a recognized mental health condition, and that I was aware of her struggles but failed to get her help. The letter included a statement from a therapist Tessa apparently saw twice last year, who diagnosed her with anxiety and depression. There was no mention of shopping addiction in the therapist's notes, just general statements about stress and mood. Roberto argued that Tessa shouldn't be held solely responsible for debt incurred due to an untreated mental illness. He cited studies about compulsive buying disorder and how it affected judgment and impulse control. The letter painted me as a negligent husband who watched his wife spiral into addiction without intervening, then punished her for being sick. It made me sound cruel and controlling. Roberto said Tessa was willing to accept responsibility for her condition and enter treatment, but that the debt should be shared equally because I benefited from the purchases too. I read the letter twice and felt my blood pressure rising. Charles called me after I'd had time to digest it and said not to worry, that Roberto was doing his job by trying to create sympathy. We scheduled a meeting to craft our response. Charles and I spent an afternoon in his office going through every piece of evidence I'd collected. We built a timeline showing how Tessa systematically concealed her shopping, opening accounts in my name without permission, lying about prices, editing email confirmations, and keeping refund money in a secret account. Charles said mental illness didn't excuse fraud, and we needed to show that Tessa knew her behavior was wrong because she actively hid it. If she truly couldn't control herself, why did she go to such lengths to deceive me? Why did she have packages delivered to multiple addresses? Why did she edit receipts and lie about costs? Those weren't the actions of someone who lacked impulse control. Those were the actions of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and didn't want to get caught. We drafted a response letter pointing out that Tessa only claimed shopping was therapy when confronted, not before. She never sought help for an addiction. She never told me she was struggling. Instead, she stole my identity, opened credit cards, and lied for years. The secret bank account proved she understood the concept of right and wrong because she hid the evidence. Charles included copies of the edited emails, screenshots of her multiple delivery addresses, and bank statements showing the secret account. He wrote that while we sympathized with anyone struggling with mental health issues, those issues didn't give someone the right to commit fraud and identity theft. The letter was 8 pages long and dismantled Roberto's argument piece by piece. Charles said Roberto was good at his job, but the evidence of intentional deception was too strong for the mental illness defense to work completely. It might create some sympathy with a judge, but it wouldn't erase what Tessa did. 2 weeks after I moved out, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Courtney calling from a friend's phone. She said Tessa had stopped eating and was just shopping online constantly, that she'd ordered over $20,000 worth of stuff in the past week. Their parents were freaking out. Regina was threatening to have Tessa committed. Isaac was trying to get her into an inpatient program. Courtney said I needed to come back and help, because I was the only one Tessa would listen to. I told Courtney that Tessa needed professional help, not me coming back. I said her family needed to stop enabling her by giving her money or access to credit. Courtney got quiet, and then defensive. She said I was being cruel, that Tessa was clearly having a mental health crisis, and I was making it worse by abandoning her. I reminded Courtney that she helped Tessa hide packages at her house for years, making her complicit in the deception. She'd let Tessa use her address knowing it was to hide shopping from me. That wasn't helping. That was enabling. I told her real help meant facing consequences, not avoiding them. Tessa needed to hit bottom before she'd change. Courtney said I was heartless and hung up. I stared at my phone for a minute, and then felt good about holding my boundary instead of rushing back to fix things like I always did before. Charles called a week later to schedule a mediation session with Roberto. He said it was our chance to reach a settlement on asset division and debt responsibility before going to court. Going to court would cost more in legal fees and take months longer. He warned me that Tessa would probably try to use the session to manipulate me emotionally. She'd cry, she'd look terrible, she'd make me feel guilty. I needed to stay focused on the facts and numbers no matter what she said. We spent 2 hours preparing, going over every document and every anticipated argument. Charles made me practice responding to emotional manipulation without getting defensive or angry. He said the mediator would be neutral, but might be sympathetic to Tessa if she played the victim well. We needed to present our case calmly and let the evidence speak for itself. Charles had organized everything into a binder with tabs, each section proving a different aspect of Tessa's deception. He said to let him do most of the talking, but to be ready to answer questions directly if the mediator asked. We ran through possible scenarios until I felt prepared for whatever Tessa might throw at me. The mediation session was scheduled for a Thursday morning at a neutral office building. I got there early and sat in my car trying to calm my nerves. Charles showed up and we walked in together. The mediator was a woman in her 60s named Barbara, who explained the process while we waited for Tessa and Roberto. When they arrived, I wasn't prepared for how bad Tessa looked. She'd lost at least 15 pounds and had dark circles under her eyes. Her clothes hung on her, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. She started crying the moment she saw me, not dramatic sobbing, but quiet tears that ran down her face. Barbara offered tissues and gave Tessa a minute to compose herself. The mediator was professional, but I could tell she was sympathetic to Tessa's obvious distress. She saw a woman in pain, and I could feel her inclination to view this as a sad case of mental illness rather than financial abuse. Roberto started by presenting Tessa as a victim of her own brain chemistry who needed treatment and support, not punishment. He talked about compulsive buying disorder and how Tessa was now in intensive therapy. He said she took full responsibility for her condition and wanted to make amends. Then Charles started talking. He walked through the timeline methodically, showing how Tessa systematically hid her shopping over years. He presented the evidence of lies about prices, the fraudulent accounts, the secret bank account where she kept refund money. He showed the edited email confirmations and the multiple delivery addresses. He explained that Tessa knew her behavior was wrong because she actively concealed it. This wasn't impulsive shopping. It was calculated deception. Charles spoke calmly, letting the documents tell the story. I watched Barbara's expression shift as she realized this wasn't just a woman who couldn't control herself. This was someone who'd committed fraud and identity theft over years while lying to her husband. The sympathy didn't disappear, but it became more complicated. We broke for lunch after 2 hours of presentations. Charles and I went to a sandwich shop across the street, and he said it was going better than expected. The evidence was undeniable, and Barbara was smart enough to see through Roberto's strategy. But he warned me we'd probably have to compromise on debt division. No judge would make Tessa responsible for everything, even with proof of fraud. When we returned, Roberto proposed that Tessa take responsibility for 70% of the debt in exchange for me not pursuing fraud charges and agreeing to a quick divorce. Charles and I countered with 85% and Tessa getting nothing from the sale of our apartment. Roberto said that was too harsh, and Tessa started crying again. Barbara suggested we take a break and think about our positions overnight. Roberto started talking again about how Tessa needed support, not punishment, but I could see the mediator wasn't buying it anymore. She'd seen the evidence, and she knew this wasn't just about mental illness. Tessa's crying got louder, and she kept saying I was destroying her life. She said she'd be homeless and alone while I moved on like nothing happened. She talked about our 8 years together like they meant nothing to me. The mediator looked uncomfortable and asked if we needed another break. Roberto jumped on that and suggested we take a day to think about our positions. The mediator agreed and said everyone should cool off and reconsider. We scheduled another session for 2 days later. Tessa wouldn't look at me as she left with her father. Charles packed up his documents and told me this was actually progress because the mediator saw through the manipulation. But I felt awful watching Tessa fall apart, even though I knew she'd caused all of this. I drove back to Gavin's place feeling completely drained. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and I kept replaying Tessa's crying in my head. Gavin was home early and took one look at my face and asked how it went. I told him about the mediation and how Tessa broke down. He nodded and started making dinner without saying much. We ate pasta at his small kitchen table, and he finally told me about his first divorce. His ex-wife had cried and manipulated him for months. She made him feel like a monster for leaving, even though she'd been cheating on him. He said he almost went back to her 3 times because the guilt was so intense. But then he realized staying would have destroyed them both. He looked at me and said, "Guilt is normal, but it doesn't mean I'm wrong. Tessa's tears don't erase years of financial abuse." I needed to hear that. I went to bed early and slept hard for the first time in days. 2 days later, I was at work when Charles called. Tessa had gone on another massive shopping spree the night before. She'd spent $8,000 in one day on clothes and home goods and random stuff. Her parents found out when the credit card company called them because she'd maxed out a card Regina had given her for emergencies. Regina apparently had her own breakdown when she saw the charges. Isaac called Roberto and told him they were done enabling Tessa. They wouldn't give her any more money or let her use their credit cards. Roberto had called Charles that morning to tell him about it. Charles said this actually helped our case because it proved Tessa hadn't changed, despite all her promises. She was still shopping compulsively even in the middle of divorce proceedings. The mediator would see this as proof that Tessa needed serious help and couldn't be trusted with shared finances. The next morning, Roberto called Charles with a new offer. Tessa would accept 80% of the debt responsibility. She'd also agree to mandatory treatment for shopping addiction at a program her therapist recommended. In exchange, she wanted to keep some of the furniture from our apartment and her car. Charles thought this was as good as we'd get without going to court. Going to court would cost thousands more in legal fees and take months longer. He asked what I wanted to do. I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen. Part of me wanted to fight for everything, but I was so tired. I just wanted this over, so I could start rebuilding my life. I told Charles to accept the terms. He said he'd call Roberto back and start drafting the settlement agreement. We scheduled a final mediation session for the following week to sign everything. I took the morning off work and met Charles at the mediator's office. Tessa showed up with Isaac, but not Regina. She looked different from last time, less hysterical and more resigned. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. She wore jeans and a plain sweater instead of the dress she'd worn to previous sessions. The mediator had all the paperwork ready. She walked through each section explaining what it meant. Tessa would take 80% of the debt. I'd take 20%. She'd keep her car and some furniture we'd agreed on. I'd keep the rest and whatever money came from selling the apartment. The divorce would be final in 60 days from signing. Both of us had to follow the financial terms immediately. Tessa signed each page without looking at me. Her hand shook as she wrote her initials. I signed my pages and felt nothing. The mediator congratulated us on reaching an agreement and said the court would process everything within a few weeks. After we finished signing, Tessa asked if she could talk to me alone for 5 minutes. The mediator looked at me and I nodded. We stepped into the hallway outside the office. Tessa leaned against the wall and finally looked at me. She said she was sorry. She knew she'd destroyed everything, and she understood why I was leaving. She said she was starting intensive therapy next week at a program that specializes in shopping addiction. She hoped someday I could forgive her even if we weren't together. I told her I hoped she got the help she needed. I meant it. But I also knew I could never trust her again. She'd lied too many times and stolen too much. She nodded like she understood, and we went back inside. Isaac shook my hand before they left. Charles and I walked to our cars, and he said I should feel proud of how I handled everything. I just felt empty. The next week, I started separating our finances completely. I went to the bank with copies of the divorce paperwork and closed all our joint accounts. The bank representative was helpful and didn't ask too many questions. She helped me open new accounts in just my name. She showed me how to set up alerts on my phone so I'd know immediately if anyone tried to access my accounts. She walked me through freezing my credit properly this time so Tessa couldn't open anything else. It took 3 hours to do everything. I had to sign so many forms my hand cramped. But each step made me feel more secure. I was finally in control of my own money again. The representative gave me her card and said to call if I had any problems. I thanked her and left feeling lighter than I had in months. Charles filed the final divorce paperwork with the court a few days later. He called to tell me everything was submitted, and unless Tessa contested something, we'd be officially divorced in 2 months. She wouldn't contest anything based on the settlement we'd signed. He also helped me file fraud reports on the accounts Tessa had opened in my name. We had all the documentation showing she'd used my information without permission. But Charles warned me the credit card companies would fight it. They'd argue I should have been monitoring our finances more carefully. I'd probably end up responsible for some of it despite all the proof. He said to be prepared for that. I told him I understood and thanked him for everything he'd done. He said he'd send me a final bill once the divorce was complete. I scheduled another meeting with Alina to work on a debt repayment plan. She pulled up all my accounts and we calculated everything I'd be responsible for after the settlement and fraud disputes. It came to about $35,000. She asked about my income and expenses and started building a budget. She explained that with my current salary, I could pay it off in about 4 years if I stayed disciplined. 4 years sounded like forever, but it was better than the alternative. She showed me how to track my spending and set up automatic payments. She said the key was sticking to the plan and not getting discouraged. I left her office with a binder full of worksheets and payment schedules. It was overwhelming, but also clarifying. I had a concrete plan instead of just drowning in Tessa's chaos. That evening, Gavin told me about an opening at his company. The position paid better than my current job and had better benefits. He thought I should apply even though I wasn't sure I was qualified. He said the worst they could do was say no. I updated my resume that night and submitted an application. 2 days later, I got a call for an interview. The hiring manager was friendly and asked about my background. I was honest about my situation and told her I was going through a divorce and dealing with debt from my ex-wife's shopping addiction. I said I was looking for stability and a chance to rebuild my finances. She appreciated my honesty and said she respected people who took responsibility for fixing their problems. The interview lasted an hour, and I felt good about it. A week later, she called to offer me the job. The salary was 20% higher than what I was making. I accepted immediately. Alina and I revised my repayment plan, and the new income would cut my timeline down to less than 3 years. Things were finally starting to look up. I walked into my manager's office on Monday morning and gave notice at my current job. She seemed surprised because I'd been there for 4 years and never complained. I told her I got a better opportunity and would work out my 2 weeks. Then I called the warehouse where I'd been doing weekend shifts and told them I was done immediately. They didn't care much because turnover there was constant anyway. That second job had been pure survival mode, just trying to keep up with Tessa's spending. Now I was finally free of it. The first Saturday I had off in 3 years, I woke up at 9 instead of 5 and just lay in bed staring at the ceiling. No alarm, no rushing to clock in, no loading trucks for 8 hours. It felt wrong somehow, like I was forgetting something important. Gavin texted asking if I wanted to grab lunch, and I realized I could actually say yes. We met at a burger place near his house, and he laughed when I told him about my weird morning. He said it would take a while to adjust to having a normal schedule again. He asked what I was going to do with all my free time, and I honestly didn't know. I'd spent so long just working and managing Tessa's chaos that I couldn't remember what I used to enjoy. Gavin suggested I join his gym because they had a good deal for new members. I told him I'd think about it, but really I was already planning to sign up. Having something to do with my mornings besides work sounded amazing. The apartment sold in 2 weeks because the market was hot, and we'd kept it in decent shape despite all of Tessa's stuff. The realtor said young couples loved the layout and location. We got almost exactly what we paid for it 5 years ago, which meant after paying off the mortgage there was only about $8,000 in equity to split. Per the settlement, I got $4,000, which was exactly enough for first and last month on a small place, plus a little leftover for furniture. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in an older building about 20 minutes from my new job. It was maybe a third the size of what Tessa and I had, but the rent was reasonable and it was all mine. No shared spaces, no joint decisions, no one else's stuff taking over every surface. The landlord did a walkthrough with me and pointed out that the previous tenant had left it very clean. I signed the lease that day. Moving in took one Saturday afternoon because I barely had anything. Most of our furniture had been Tessa's impulse purchases, and I didn't want any of it. I took my clothes, my laptop, the TV from the spare room, and some kitchen basics. Gavin helped me load everything into his truck, and we made one trip. The apartment looked empty with just a bed, a small couch, and a folding table I'd bought at a discount store. But it felt clean and simple in a way that made me breathe easier. No decorative pillows, no unused exercise equipment, no boxes of stuff we'd never opened. Just space and quiet. I spent the evening setting up my few belongings and ordering pizza. Gavin stayed for dinner and we watched a game on my TV. He said the place had good energy and I agreed. It was the first space I'd had that felt like mine in years. Courtney called me 3 weeks after I moved out. I almost didn't answer because I was done with Tessa's family and their drama. But something made me pick up. She started talking fast, apologizing for helping Tessa hide packages at her house and for not seeing how bad things had gotten. She said she'd been going to Al-Anon meetings because her therapist suggested it. Apparently she had her own issues with enabling family members and needed to work through them. I listened without saying much. She told me Tessa was in intensive outpatient therapy 3 days a week and had been sober from shopping for 3 weeks. She was going to support groups for compulsive buying disorder and actually seemed committed to getting help. I told Courtney I was glad Tessa was doing better, but I needed distance from her whole family while I figured out my own life. Courtney said she understood and respected that. She asked if she could check in occasionally just to let me know how things were going, and I said maybe in a few months. I needed space first. She thanked me for listening and said she hoped I was doing okay. After we hung up, I felt weird. Part of me was relieved Tessa was getting help. Part of me didn't care anymore because it wasn't my problem. I decided not to think about it too much and went for a run instead. The 60-day waiting period ended on a Tuesday in March. I woke up that morning knowing today was the day my marriage officially ended. No court appearance, no dramatic scene, just paperwork being processed somewhere in a government building. Charles emailed me at 10 with the final decree attached. He congratulated me on making it through and reminded me to keep copies of everything in case Tessa violated the financial terms of the settlement. I saved the file in 3 different places and printed 2 copies. One went in a folder with all my divorce documents, the other went in a safety deposit box I'd rented at the bank. I took a long lunch break and went to a nice restaurant downtown. Sat at the bar and ordered a steak and a beer. The bartender asked if I was celebrating something and I said sort of. He didn't push for details. I ate slowly and watched people walking by outside. Couples holding hands, parents with strollers, business people on their phones. Everyone just living their normal lives while mine was completely different from it had been a year ago. I felt relieved that it was finally over. No more lawyers, no more mediation, no more fighting about money. But I also felt sad in a way I hadn't expected. 8 years of my life had just ended with an email and a PDF. All those memories and plans and hopes just gone. I finished my beer and paid the check. Walked back to work feeling like I'd closed a door I could never open again. Isaac called the following Tuesday. I saw his name on my phone and considered not answering, but decided I might as well hear what he wanted. He told me Tessa had been doing really well in therapy and wanted him to pass along a message. She wasn't going to contest any of the fraud disputes with the credit card companies. She admitted she'd opened those accounts without my permission and wanted to make it right. Isaac said this would help my case a lot because the companies would see she acknowledged the fraud. I thanked him for letting me know. He was quiet for a minute, then said he was proud of me for holding my boundaries through everything. He admitted he wished he'd done the same with Tessa years ago, instead of just giving her money whenever she asked. He said he and Regina were in therapy too, trying to understand how they'd enabled her for so long. I told him I appreciated that, and I was glad they were getting help. He asked if we could stay in touch occasionally, maybe grab coffee every few months. I thought about it and said sure. Despite everything, I didn't hate Isaac. He'd been manipulated by Tessa just like I had, and at least he was trying to face it now. We agreed to text sometimes and maybe meet up when enough time had passed. After we hung up, I felt okay about it. Not every part of my old life had to be completely cut off. 3 months after moving into my apartment, I finally felt like I had a routine that worked. I woke up at 6 and went for a run before work. Made breakfast in my small kitchen instead of grabbing fast food. Got to my job on time without being exhausted from a second shift. Came home in the evening and actually had energy to cook dinner and do things I enjoyed. I joined the gym Gavin recommended and started going 3 times a week. It felt good to be active and take care of myself instead of just surviving. My coworkers noticed the change. A few people commented that I looked healthier and seemed more relaxed. One guy asked if I'd been on vacation because I seemed so different. I told him I'd just made some life changes, and he said whatever I was doing was working. I started cooking real meals instead of eating frozen stuff or takeout. Tried new recipes I found online, bought actual groceries and planned my week. It was basic stuff, but it felt revolutionary after years of chaos. I even started reading again, something I hadn't done since before I married Tessa. Joined a book club that met at a coffee shop near my apartment. Made a few friends who didn't know anything about my divorce or my past. They just knew me as the guy who liked mystery novels and always showed up on time. It was nice to have parts of my life that weren't connected to all the drama. Alina called to check on my progress in May. She pulled up my accounts and looked at my payment history. She said she was impressed because I'd stuck to the plan perfectly and even paid extra some months. My credit score had gone up 40 points since we first met. At my current rate, I'd be debt-free in 3 years instead of 4. The credit card companies were settling most of the fraud disputes in my favor once they saw the divorce decree and the reports I'd filed. 2 of the big accounts Tessa had opened got removed completely from my credit report. That knocked about $12,000 off my total debt. Alina said cases like mine usually took years to resolve, but having all the documentation made it easier. She reminded me to keep making payments on time and to save the settlement letters from each company. I told her I had a whole filing system now and she laughed. She said I'd come a long way from the overwhelmed guy who first walked into her office. We scheduled another check-in for 6 months out. After the call, I looked at my budget spreadsheet and felt proud. I was actually doing this, fixing the mess Tessa had made and building something stable. A letter came from Tessa's therapist in June. It was addressed to me at my new apartment, which meant Tessa must have given her my address. The letter said Tessa was working on making amends to people she'd harmed as part of her treatment. The therapist requested permission to contact me to discuss this process. I read it twice, then called Charles. He said I had no obligation to participate in Tessa's therapy, and that setting boundaries was completely appropriate. I told him I was glad Tessa was getting help, but I needed to focus on my own healing. He agreed and said he'd send a response declining the request. He reminded me that just because Tessa was in therapy didn't mean I owed her anything. Her recovery was her responsibility, not mine. I felt relieved hearing that. Part of me had felt guilty for not wanting to help, like I was being mean by refusing. But Charles was right. I'd spent years being supportive and accommodating, and it had nearly destroyed me. I didn't need to do it anymore. Charles sent the letter that week. I never heard from the therapist again. Gavin invited me to a work happy hour in July. I almost said no because I usually went straight home after work. But I'd been feeling more social lately and decided to go. The bar was crowded with people from our office and a few from other companies in the building. I got a beer and talked to some coworkers I didn't know that well. Then Gavin introduced me to April Kaufman, a project manager who'd just moved to town for work. She had an easy smile and seemed genuinely interested when people talked. We ended up in a corner booth talking for almost 2 hours. She told me about her move and her new job. I told her about mine without mentioning the divorce. We talked about books and movies and places we wanted to travel. Normal stuff that felt refreshing after so much heaviness. She was funny and smart and didn't take herself too seriously. When the group started leaving, she asked for my number. I gave it to her feeling nervous but good. Like maybe I was ready to try meeting new people again. Gavin gave me a look when we left and I told him to shut up. He just laughed and said it was about time. April and I started texting the next day. Just casual stuff about work and weekend plans. She asked if I wanted to grab coffee that Saturday and I said yes. We met at a place near my apartment and talked for an hour. I told her I was recently divorced and needed to take things slow. She appreciated the honesty and said she was coming out of a long relationship too. We agreed we were both in rebuilding phases and wanted to be careful about what came next. She suggested we keep hanging out as friends and see what happened naturally. No pressure, no expectations, just 2 people getting to know each other. That worked for me. We got coffee again the following week, then dinner the week after that. It felt easy and comfortable. She didn't ask a million questions about my ex or try to fix me. She just showed up and was herself. I liked that she had her own life and interests. She wasn't looking for someone to complete her, just someone to share things with. We texted most days and saw each other once or twice a week. It was the healthiest start to something I'd ever experienced. 4 months after the divorce became final, My desk phone rang while I was reviewing spreadsheets at work. The voice on the other end identified herself as a supervisor from one of the credit card companies where Tessa had opened an account in my name. She told me they were closing the dispute case in my favor and removing $15,000 from my responsibility because the evidence of fraud was clear. I sat there stunned because this was the biggest disputed account, the one I thought would be the hardest to prove. She explained they'd reviewed the divorce decree, the fraud reports, and the timeline of when the account was opened and determined I had no knowledge of or consent to the charges. I thanked her 3 times before hanging up and immediately pulled out my debt tracking spreadsheet. With this $15,000 gone, my total remaining debt dropped from $35,000 to only $20,000. I called Alina right away and she answered on the second ring. I told her about the decision and she actually cheered over the phone. We scheduled a meeting for the next day to revise my repayment plan, and she said at this rate I'd be debt-free in less than 2 years instead of 4. I spent the rest of the workday feeling lighter than I had in months, checking my phone every few minutes to make sure the call had really happened. That weekend, I texted April asking if she wanted to get dinner somewhere nice instead of our usual casual spots. She said yes and suggested an Italian place downtown she'd been wanting to try. We met there Saturday evening and I waited until after we ordered to tell her I had good news to celebrate. She leaned forward with genuine interest as I explained about the credit card dispute being resolved and what it meant for my debt timeline. Then I took a breath and told her I needed to explain the full story of my marriage and divorce, everything I'd only mentioned in pieces before. She nodded and settled back in her chair, and I started from the beginning with Tessa's shopping addiction and how it escalated during the pandemic. I told her about working 2 jobs, the secret credit cards, the returns I did without telling Tessa, using Black Friday refunds to hire Charles. I explained the divorce process, the settlement negotiations, the fraud I was still disputing with credit card companies. April listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful but not judgmental. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said she was impressed by how I'd handled an impossible situation. She told me my honesty about my past actually made her trust me more, not less, because it showed I was willing to be real about my mistakes and what I'd learned. We agreed to keep seeing each other and let things develop naturally without pressure or expectations. Dinner felt easy after that, like we'd crossed some invisible line into deeper territory without forcing it. The following Tuesday, Gavin stopped by my desk at work looking slightly uncomfortable. He asked if I had a minute and we walked to the break room where he told me his daughter was moving back to town and would need the spare room in about a month. I'd been expecting this eventually since he'd mentioned she was considering relocating for a job opportunity. I told him I understood completely and appreciated him giving me notice. Honestly, I felt ready to live alone again after months of roommate life, even though Gavin had been great about giving me space. That evening, I started searching rental listings online, filtering for studios and small 1-bedrooms I could afford while staying on track with my debt payments. Most places were either too expensive or in sketchy neighborhoods, but after 3 days of searching, I found a studio apartment in a decent area that fit my budget perfectly. The building was older but well-maintained, and the unit had good natural light and enough space for one person starting over. I scheduled a viewing for that Saturday and brought April with me for a second opinion. She walked around the small space, checking water pressure and outlet placement while I talked to the landlord about lease terms. After he left to let us discuss privately, April said it felt right for where I was in life, and that the location was convenient to both my work and her apartment. I signed the lease that afternoon, feeling proud of how far I'd come from the chaos of my marriage. Moving day arrived 3 weeks later on a Saturday morning. April showed up at Gavin's place at 8 with coffee and offered to help load my car. I didn't have much to move since I'd left most of our shared belongings with Tessa in the divorce settlement. My possessions fit in 4 boxes, 2 suitcases, and a few bags. Gavin helped us carry everything down to my car and gave me a solid hug before we left, telling me his door was always open if I needed anything. At the new studio, April and I spent the afternoon unpacking boxes and arranging furniture in the limited space. She had good instincts about where things should go and made the process feel collaborative rather than like she was taking over. We set up my small desk by the window, arranged books on the single bookshelf, hung my few pieces of artwork on the walls. By evening, the space looked lived in and intentional, every item chosen and placed with purpose. April ordered pizza, and we ate sitting on my new couch, the only furniture I'd bought specifically for this place. The studio felt comfortable and manageable in a way my apartment with Tessa never did, probably because there were no hidden packages or secret shopping apps draining resources. April didn't push to stay over or hint about spending more time there, and I appreciated her patience with letting our relationship develop at its own pace. When she left that night, I stood in my studio alone and felt genuinely content for the first time in years. 6 months after the divorce became final, I woke up on a Tuesday morning and made coffee in my small kitchen while checking my bank account on my phone. My debt balance showed only $10,000 remaining, which I was paying off ahead of schedule thanks to my increased salary and careful budgeting. My credit score had recovered significantly from the damage Tessa's fraudulent accounts had caused, jumping almost 100 points in half a year. I was dating April regularly without any pressure to define what we were or rush into serious commitment. My job had become something I actually enjoyed rather than just a paycheck, and my coworkers had evolved from acquaintances into genuine friends who invited me to things outside work. I poured my coffee and stood by the window watching morning light fill the studio, and something shifted in my chest. The constant weight I'd carried for years was gone, replaced by this unfamiliar lightness. I realized I hadn't felt this unburdened since before I married Tessa, maybe even longer. My life was simple and small, but it was entirely mine, built on honesty and sustainability instead of chaos and deception. My phone buzzed with a text from Courtney, the first time she'd contacted me in months. The message said Tessa had been sober from shopping for 6 months and was working part-time at a nonprofit, living with Isaac and Regina while she rebuilt her life. Courtney wrote that she wanted me to know Tessa was doing better and making real progress in therapy, but she understood if I didn't want to reach out. I read the message twice and felt genuinely glad Tessa was getting help and facing her addiction. But I also knew my healing had required complete separation from her and her entire family, and reaching out now would undo that boundary. I texted back thanking Courtney for the update and saying I hoped Tessa continued doing well, but that I needed to maintain distance for my own recovery. Courtney responded immediately saying she respected that and just wanted me to know Tessa was okay. I appreciated her understanding and put my phone away, returning to my morning coffee without the guilt I might have felt months earlier. April and I had been dating for 4 months when she called me on a Wednesday evening sounding excited but nervous. She said she'd received a job offer in another city, a significant promotion that was too good to pass up professionally. My stomach dropped, but I told her congratulations and asked when she'd need to move. She said they wanted her to start in 6 weeks, which meant she'd be leaving soon. We agreed to meet for dinner that Friday to talk about what this meant for us. At the restaurant, we were honest about our options, discussing whether long distance made sense or if we should end things now. April said she cared about me, but wasn't sure we were at a place where long distance was realistic, especially since we'd both been intentionally taking things slow. I agreed, admitting I wasn't ready for that level of commitment, and trying to force it seemed wrong. We decided to end our relationship amicably, rather than testing something that wasn't ready for that kind of challenge. The conversation was sad but mature, both of us acknowledging what we'd meant to each other while accepting the timing wasn't right. We finished dinner and walked to our cars, hugging goodbye in the parking lot. I felt sad driving home but not devastated, and I recognized that as growth. I could handle loss without falling apart or making it mean something catastrophic about my worth. 8 months after signing my debt repayment plan with Alina, I sat at my desk on a Friday afternoon and logged into my bank account to make what I knew was my final payment. The remaining balance was $273, a number I'd been watching shrink for months with a mix of determination and disbelief. I transferred the money and watched the balance drop to 0, then sat staring at the screen for a full minute. I called Alina immediately and told her I was officially debt-free, 8 months ahead of my original timeline. She congratulated me enthusiastically, saying most people in my situation took much longer or gave up entirely when the work got hard. She told me I should be proud of doing the work to recover from financial abuse and that starting over completely debt-free at my age was rare and valuable. After we hung up, I forwarded the zero balance confirmation to Charles, who responded within minutes saying he was glad to see me thriving after everything. That evening, I treated myself to a nice dinner alone at a steakhouse downtown, ordering exactly what I wanted without checking prices or feeling guilty. I raised my glass of wine in a silent toast to the end of that chapter, feeling the weight of years of financial stress finally lift completely. A year after my divorce from Tessa became final, I found myself in the best financial and emotional shape of my adult life. I had $3,000 in savings, the first emergency fund I'd ever built. My credit score had climbed into the good range, and I was getting pre-approved credit card offers instead of rejection letters. Work was going well enough that my boss had mentioned a promotion was likely within the next quarter. I was casually dating a woman I'd met through friends, keeping things light without pressure to find my next serious relationship. On a Saturday morning, I stopped at a coffee shop near my apartment and ran into Isaac standing in line. We recognized each other at the same moment, and after a brief, awkward pause, he smiled and asked if I wanted to sit for a few minutes. We got our coffees and found a table by the window, where Isaac told me Tessa was doing well in her recovery, attending meetings regularly, and maintaining her part-time job. He said he was proud of her progress and grateful she'd finally gotten real help. Then he looked at me directly and said, I looked happy and healthy, better than he'd seen me in years. I told him I was doing well and appreciated him saying so. We talked for 20 minutes about neutral topics, and when we parted ways, it felt complete without any lingering resentment or unfinished business. The following Tuesday, I scheduled my first therapy appointment, because even though my life was good, I wanted to understand how I'd ended up in such a broken marriage and make sure I didn't repeat those patterns. The therapist's office was in a quiet building downtown, and she spent our first session asking about my relationship history and what brought me in. I told her about Tessa's shopping addiction, the financial abuse, the divorce, and my recovery process. Then I admitted I wanted to understand why I'd stayed so long and worked 2 jobs instead of setting boundaries earlier. Over the next several sessions, she helped me see how I'd enabled Tessa by sacrificing myself rather than confronting the problem directly. She explained that I'd confused self-sacrifice with love, believing that if I just worked harder and provided more, Tessa would eventually be satisfied and things would get better. We talked about how I'd ignored red flags early in our relationship because I wanted to believe love could fix everything. She taught me to recognize patterns where I prioritize other people's needs over my own well-being and how that dynamic had set up our marriage to fail from the start. Learning to set boundaries and prioritize myself felt revolutionary, like I was finally giving myself permission to have needs and limits that mattered. Gavin started showing up at my apartment on Sunday mornings with coffee and running shoes, refusing to take no for an answer until I agreed to join him. We'd run 3 miles through the neighborhood and then grab breakfast at a diner where the waitress knew our orders by heart. He asked about my therapy sessions and whether I was dating anyone, sharing stories about his own messy divorce 5 years ago and how long it took him to trust anyone again. One morning he stopped mid-run and told me he was proud of how I'd handled everything, that watching me rebuild gave him hope his past didn't have to define his future forever. I realized our friendship had become something real, not just a coworker helping out someone in crisis, and I told him I was grateful he'd offered that spare room when I needed it most. We kept running every Sunday after that, talking about work projects and terrible first dates, and whether either of us would ever get married again. I started apartment hunting 6 months after paying off my debt, looking for something bigger than the studio, but still affordable on my new salary. The place I found was in a neighborhood with actual trees and coffee shops, a 1-bedroom with hardwood floors and enough space for a real kitchen table. I signed the lease and spent weekends furnishing it slowly, buying a couch I actually liked instead of whatever was cheapest, choosing dishes that matched instead of random mismatched plates. Each purchase felt deliberate and mine, nothing like the chaos of living with Tessa where stuff just appeared constantly. I hung artwork I'd picked out myself and bought exactly 4 throw pillows for the couch, laughing when I realized I was counting them. My home reflected the life I was building, simple and intentional and free from the weight of someone else's addiction. 18 months after leaving Tessa, my company held a networking event at a downtown hotel, and I went because my boss suggested it would be good for my career. I was standing by the bar when someone next to me made a joke about the terrible wine selection, and I turned to see a woman with short dark hair and an easy smile. Her name was Harlow Barrett, and she worked as a consultant for tech companies, traveling constantly but based in the city. We talked for an hour about everything except work, and she made me laugh more than I had in months, her humor sharp but never mean. I asked for her number before we left, and she texted me the next day suggesting dinner. On our 3rd date, I told her about Tessa and the shopping addiction and the divorce, expecting her to make an excuse and disappear. Instead, she thanked me for being honest and said my self-awareness made her trust me more, not less. We started seeing each other regularly, and everything felt different from the beginning, built on actual communication instead of me trying to fix someone who didn't want to be fixed. 2 years after the divorce, I woke up in my apartment next to Harlow and realized my life looked nothing like it had when I was married to Tessa. I had a career that challenged me and paid well, friendships with people like Gavin who showed up consistently, a relationship with someone who respected boundaries and communicated openly. My credit score was good, and I had savings, and I could buy things without panic or guilt. Most importantly, I had peace, the kind that comes from knowing what you won't accept anymore. The years with Tessa taught me what dysfunction looks like and how easy it is to enable someone by sacrificing yourself. I didn't regret the marriage because those lessons shaped who I became, but I was grateful every single day to be free of that chaos. I was building something real and sustainable on my own terms, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be.